This morning we obviously studied about the idea of faith and how our faith affects the view of where our home really is and what becomes valuable and invaluable to us. And I thought this afternoon, for just a few moments here, we might spend just a little bit of time talking about, how our faith and really our view of home affects a Christian's view of death. And I think it should be obvious probably to all of us that, a Christian's view of death is vastly different than that of a non-Christian. When you read the writings of Paul, it's pretty obvious that the way that he viewed his life here upon this earth and what happened in death was different than what the world did. In fact, you're probably familiar with Philippians 1:21, where Paul said, For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Paul wrote that verse from a jail cell, not knowing if he was going to be executed or not. And so the reality of death for him was one that was very real when he penned those words. But notice what he said. He said, well, if I live, that's Christ. That's working for Christ. That's being an example, doing everything that Christ wants me to do. But if I die, he said, that's gain for him. And the reason that he viewed death in that way is because as a Christian, you know what lies beyond death for you. For a Christian to depart from this life, we enjoy this life. There's a lot of good things in it. But this life is nothing to compare with the one to come. And so to leave this one to go to the next one is a blessing for any faithful Christian. And of course, Paul emphasized his emphasis here on the life to come, or on his life, really shaped his view of death. Later on, some years later, Paul, of course, was released from jail there, or we believe that he was, from the jail at Philippi. But some years later, Paul found himself back in jail. And this time, he knew that the end was coming. But here's what he wrote then in 2 Timothy 4:6-8. He said, For I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give to me, and not to me only, but to all them also that love his appearing. Paul understood that death is the means, for a Christian, death is the means by which hope becomes reality. I don't want to try to indicate that Paul was suicidal. He wasn't anything like that. But he was far from fearing death when you read about the way that he viewed it. In fact, for him, death was his crowning moment. It is the moment when all the things that he worked for and all the joys that he hoped to experience were going to become true. And when we read about the idea of death, it's not that as Christians there's not any sorrow associated with it, or even that we shouldn't grieve. In fact, in 1 Thessalonians 4:13, Paul said, I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, that ye sorrow not, even as others which have no hope. Paul wrote to the church there at Thessalonica. He wasn't saying don't cry. He said just don't let them be tears without any hope to them. And, you see the idea of sorrow. There's always a sadness that's associated when you're not going to see anybody anymore. When Paul talked to the elders at Ephesus in Acts chapter 20 and verse 38, they were basically crying because Paul had told them, you're not going to see me again. And it tells us that in verse 38 that they sorrowed most of all for the words that he spake, that they should see his face no more. And so there's a sorrow that's associated with finality, not being able to see somebody again. The church at Thessalonica felt it. Paul himself felt it. But it's a sorrow. We don't cry without hope in our hearts. And so it's for a Christian, death isn't like a person in the world when it comes to their passing from this life. A lot of times worldly people who basically set their home up to be here on earth, when they've departed this life, what do people do? Well, they reminisce, right? They say, well, look back at the good old days that he enjoyed here upon this earth. Look at all the glorious achievements that they made. And don't we wish that we could go back to that point in time? But for a Christian, it's not about looking back. Those aren't the glory days. The best days are the days that are going to lay ahead. And so what did Paul know? He knew that a crown of righteousness was waiting for him. He knew that he had a home in glory with God. And so for a Christian, when we depart from this life, it's gain, it's better life, it's better bodies, it's better experience. All of it's better than the things that we have here upon this earth. There's a famous preacher whose wife passed away. I'm not going to tell you his name, but he wrote a letter to one of his friends, and he expressed this attitude that we're talking about, the Christian's view of death, in this letter. He said, "I have some of the best news to impart. One beloved by you has accomplished her warfare, has received an answer to her prayers, and everlasting joy rests upon her head. My dear wife, the source of my best earthly comfort for 20 years, departed on Tuesday." You know, when I read that, I understand that, that man wrote those words, not because he didn't feel any sadness in his heart at the loss of his wife, but he understood what death meant for her. For her, it meant reaching her home. That's what we were talking about this morning. This world isn't it, but we've got a better home in mind. For her, it meant experiencing the joy, that she had longed for and lived her life hoping for. And so in death, Christians, by faith, see better things in an eternal place. And we read in Hebrews 11:13, I like the way the NIV words it here. Notice a little bit difference. It says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. That's the idea that we were talking about. When they died, when they departed from this life, they were still believing in God, weren't they? And think about faith, what a difference it makes in our lives. Abraham's approach to death is very instructive in how a faithful follower of God views death, because we pointed out he didn't receive any promised land, during his lifetime. He didn't even have a place that he could put his foot on that God gave to him to fulfill that promise. But remember what he did when Sarah died. We read in Genesis chapter 23. I told you a little bit of the background about it this morning, so I'll not bore you with all the details again. But when he purchased that land from that Hittite, it says in Genesis 23:19, after this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, the same as Hebron in the land of Canaan. We read about how when his wife died, Abraham, like any husband would do, he mourned, he wept over her, but then he did something that he'd never done before. And that was he bought some land. He bought some land from that Hittite. The Bible says he bought it because there was a cave that was located in it. Abraham didn't buy it to live on. He didn't go back there and then say, well, that cave would make a good place for a house, and then he set up his home within that cave. He bought it to bury his wife in. And he did that because he believed that one day God was going to fulfill his promise, and all this land, that he and his wife and all his descendants were going to be buried within that land, and they'd own it. And so the emphasis there in Hebrews 11:13 is he was still living by faith whenever Sarah died. He was still living by faith whenever he died too. And so he died still believing. And think about that as we apply it toward Christians. Shouldn't we do the same? When it comes our time to depart from this life, shouldn't we die in faith? Shouldn't we die knowing and believing those things that God has promised us are awaiting us? The Bible teaches death itself is terrible. In fact, it's a punishment for sin. That tells you a little bit, I think, about what death really is. It's not a good thing. But for those who trust in the Lord, it's the gateway into life. And so if we believe that, then our view of death will change the view of our life here upon this earth. It's not the end. It's not the finality, but it's simply the beginning of better things to come. And so that helps us as Christians as we live our life. It transforms our view of trials and sorrows and temptations in life. It transfers our idea of joy and faith. Faith means everything to a Christian in the time of death. And so, this idea of faith in our home, if we really believe that, if we really believe that our home is not here on this earth, then it's going to transform the way that we view death. And you see that, read the writings of the Apostle Paul, you just see it so clearly. Well, maybe that helps a little bit or encourages somebody a little bit. Obviously not.